Good evening. I'm Dr. Tiffany Townsend, Chief Diversity Officer at Augusta University, and I want to welcome you to tonight's exciting panel, Fostering Inclusivity, Examining and Dismantling Anti-Asian Discrimination and Hate in 2021. Tonight we want to explore the history of anti-Asian discrimination and hate, the various ways they've manifested and have been experienced by members of diverse Asian American communities. And most importantly, we want to discuss how we as a campus and a larger Augusta community can work together to eradicate hate and racial injustice. Over the past year, it's become quite clear that as a nation, we can no longer ignore the glaring racial inequities that have been underscored by numerous killings and acts of violence against people of color. And what we've come to understand very deeply over this year is that Martin Luther King Jr. was absolutely right. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Given that truth, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the impact of today's verdict and what that impact will have on our community, our society, and the fight for racial injustice, and the fight for racial justice. In an effort to help our students process this momentous verdict, our Multicultural Student Engagement Office and Student Counseling and Psychological Services will be hosting a session tomorrow at 1 p.m. on Microsoft Teams. The session information will be available on MSE's Instagram account, and you can find that at Augusta_MSE. But tonight, the focus of our discussion will be on the injustice experienced by Asian Americans. The recent mass shooting in Atlanta last month thrust anti-Asian discrimination and hate into the national discourse. But we have to appreciate that these shootings follow a surge in random violence and harassment against innocent Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in cities across our country. A surge that only recently has been discussed nationally, thanks in large part to our special guest tonight, Ms. Juju Chang, along with other journalists and activists who are taking a collective stand against anti-Asian hate. Tonight, as a university, we want to join in the fight against racial injustice and hate. And that starts with gaining a greater understanding of the pain that members of our community are facing, so that we can appropriately advocate for change. In the words of Maya Angelou, when we know better, we do better. This panel is one of many steps that we'll take together on our journey toward knowing better. So we'll start the evening with welcoming remarks from our president, Dr. Brooks Keel, our provost, Dr. Neil McKinnon, and the CEO of AU Health, Ms. Katrina Kiefer. President Keel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Townsend. Appreciate the opportunity to be here on this really very special evening for us as a university, for us as the community, and for us as individuals of that community. And I'm especially proud to be the president of an institution that would put on this event so we can address some very serious issues in this country and in our community. I'm going to keep my comments very short because I want to get to the real part of the matter tonight. I do want to just say one thing, and Dr. Townsend, I'm actually going to borrow some of your words if you will allow me. You didn't know I was going to do this. You sent an email earlier about this event, so we're reminding folks and giving instructions. And part of the sentence you said really hit home with me because I think it really says why we're here tonight. So the purpose really tonight is how we come together as a community to foster a more tolerant, inclusive campus. And in that very short sentence, you had some very profound words and statements. And the first of which is, how do we come together as a community? If we truly are going to address a racial injustice and injustice of all kinds, I think the only way we're going to be able to do it as a university is to do it together as a community. And because we are a community, and this is our community, and together we must come to address this. And we have to address this in such a way that we can have a more tolerant and inclusive campus. Tolerant and inclusive are two very straightforward words, but just have incredibly profound, deep, and far-reaching meaning. And that is obviously a goal which we all have, and one of the reasons that we're here tonight. And then lastly, we can come together, we can and talk about a tolerant, inclusive campus, but we have to foster this approach. We have to foster this approach by living in our lives every day, and by sharing it and promoting this campus-wide and beyond. So I appreciate very much everyone being here this evening, so that we can come together to address this incredibly important issue for us as a community, because together as a community, we can foster a tolerant and inclusive campus. Dr. Townsend, thank you so much for allowing me to say a few words. I really look forward to the presentation and the panel tonight.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us. Provost McKinnon.
All right. Well, thank you, Tiffany, again for the opportunity to say a few words. I'm going to follow the president's lead and keep this pretty brief. But it's interesting. I've only been, the provost at Augusta University for 3 months, but it didn't take me very long to learn about our 6 core values. I'm guessing a few of you may have heard something about that on the call tonight, and it might surprise you. I'm going to use my time actually to talk about the other 5 values and how they relate to inclusivity. And the first of which is collegiality. This obviously involves collaboration, partnership, a sense of community, and teamwork. And I would argue we actually can't be inclusive without being collegial. Secondly is compassion. This involves caring, empathy, and social responsibility. And I would argue when we're compassionate towards others, it naturally makes us more inclusive as well. Our third value is excellence. This involves distinction, effectiveness, efficiency, enthusiasm, passion, and quality. And I've shared this with Dr. Townsend previously. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Augusta University and AU Health were known for excellence nationally in inclusivity? Next one is integrity. This involves accountability, ethical behavior, honesty, and reliability. And certainly one way that we demonstrate our integrity is by being inclusive. And finally, that leads us to our last value, which is leadership. And this involves courage, honor, professionalism, transparency, and vision. And sometimes it takes courage to stand up to discrimination and hate. Sometimes it takes courage to have a frank and open conversation about this topic, like the one we're going to have this evening. So whether you're joining us this evening as an AU student, faculty or staff, or perhaps a health professional or health worker from AU Health, or just a member of the greater Augusta community, I want to thank you for being part of this very special event.
Thank you, Dr. McKinnon, and thanks for joining us today. Ms. Kiefer.
Thank you, Dr. Townsend, and good evening. I am Katrina Kiefer, the CEO of Augusta University Health System. Thank you so much to all of you for joining this meaningful discussion tonight. The foundation of who we are as a health system is supported by those core values that Dr. McKinnon was just outlining. Collegiality, compassion, excellence, inclusivity, integrity, and leadership. And if there was ever a time to elevate these values, that time is now. The substantial increase in hate crimes against people of color, including Asian Americans, combined with the global pandemic that has significantly impacted all of us, cries out for us to embrace our values. These difficult and troubling times drive us to remember our foundational commitment, and that is to lead with courage and to display genuine concern for those around us, and to help create a sense of community where everybody is a valued part. We encourage continued positive and productive conversations like the one we're having tonight, and I can't wait to hear the presentation and the panel. And I really appreciate our DEI leaders and Dr. Townsend and Reverend Francois and your support teams for bringing us together in this way. Thank you to the Department of Spiritual Care within the health system for providing spaces where heartfelt emotions can be expressed. And know that all of our chapels are open 24/7 for any in our community. These spaces are places and safe havens where, hopefully you could also find words of hope and comfort as you need them. We do, as the president said, we stand together in recognizing that all voices should be heard and every person should be respected. We stand together to support the hurting and to help heal the pain. Living our values compels us to stand together, and we are honored to stand together as a part of this community. So thank you for being here tonight and allowing me to bring greetings on behalf of all the caregivers of the Augusta University Health System.
Thank you, Ms. Kiefer. I want to just thank Drs. Keel, McKinnon, and Ms. Kiefer for joining us tonight. Your participation reflects the importance that Augusta University places on fostering an inclusive campus. This is further demonstrated by the many partners across the enterprise that graciously gave of their time to help make this panel a reality. One of those partners is Chaplain Brennan Francois, Executive Advisor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Associate Director of Spiritual Care at AU Health. He will deliver a statement on unity and anti-racism. Chaplain Francois.
Good evening, everyone. It is my joy and privilege to share in this event tonight. Augusta University, AU Health System, and all the entities connected to us are a beautiful array of people from varied places, disciplines, professions, experiences, cultures, ethnic backgrounds, genders, ages, and so much more. While we collectively and proudly display the symbols and wear the colors of AU, and while we boldly proclaim with pride in the words of our great president, "Go Jags," the heart and value of who we are, that which truly unites us, that which makes us AU strong, resides in our ability to connect while growing to understand the unique and exceptional qualities each and every individual brings to this AU family. It was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King who said while speaking to a crowd gathered in St. Louis in 1964, "We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools." For the past 26 years, I have been honored to share conversations and experiences with so many diverse people at AU. These conversations and experiences bring Dr. King's quote into our present day. As a result, when encountering me, you might hear me reference you as brother or sister. The hope in doing this is to bring us closer together while acknowledging that AU is family. When it comes to conversations related to race, ethnicity, or color, we tend to hesitate or keep quiet. We reason that these topics are not for mixed or polite company. That is, until there's a national event that pulls at the heart of the masses. Events like the 1995 O.J. Simpson murder verdict, or the 9/11/2001 terrorist attacks, or the 2016 shooting inside Pulse, a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, or the very public death of George Floyd on May 25, 2020, or most recently, the many acts of violence toward our Asian American brothers and sisters, or, as of today, the anxiety many people in our community feel right now after the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. We gather tonight to listen and to learn. We gather to show solidarity and support, but we also gather to illustrate our ability to consistently come together, to compassionately walk and talk together. We gather to remind each other that when one laughs, we all laugh, and when one cries, we all cry. We gather tonight to say to our collective AU family, we see you, we hear you, we believe you, and we will work together with you to promote healing, to create harmony, to build unity, to produce a penetrating excitement that is felt at AU by everyone, reminding all of us every day in every place, regardless of where we come from, what we look like, how we dress or eat or worship or celebrate, or even how we style our hair, that we are, all of us, AU family.
Thank you so much, Chaplain Francois, for those beautiful and inspirational words of unity. I think you set the perfect tone for the rest of the panel tonight. So now we'll hear from our special guest, Ms. Juju Chang, who will deliver tonight's keynote address. Ms. Chang's keynote will be followed by a panel of members from our AU and Augusta community who will share their experiences. Again, we're hoping that through these testimonies, our community can gain greater understanding concerning the depths of the problem, in hopes that this knowledge will spur us toward change. Serving as the moderator for tonight's keynote address and the ensuing panel discussion is our own graduate student, Ms. Silong Chen. Silong is a second-year student in AU's Masters of Public Administration program, and currently she serves as the president of Asian Students in Augusta, also known as Asia. Please welcome Ms. Silong Chen.
Hello. Hey, thank you, Dr. Townsend, for the introductions. And hello to everyone. My name is Silong, and I immigrated from Taiwan in 2006. I became a U.S. citizen in 2012. I'd like to also take a moment to show my appreciation for Dr. Townsend and the planning committee that made this evening's event possible. With the Office of Diversity and Inclusion Support, we stand together in solidarity with our Asian communities in ARM. This event provided us an opportunity to talk about discrimination against Asians that has increased since the start of the pandemic and the ongoing racial tension in America. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Juju Chang, an Emmy Award-winning co-anchor of ABC's News Nightline. She also reports regularly for Good Morning America in 2020. Ms. Chang reported in the recent rise of hate crimes towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, AAPI community, as the anchor of ABC's News live special, Stop the Hate in the Rise of Violence Against Asian Americans and the 2020 special murder in Atlanta following the Atlanta mass shooting. Ms. Chang has been recognized in her in-depth personal narratives set against backdrop of pressing national and international news. She has covered major breaking news for decades for ABC News, including extensive COVID-19 science and the fallout of hospital ICUs, healthcare, and essential workers. A former news anchor for Good Morning America, Ms. Chang joined ABC News just after college as an entry-level desk assistant in 1987 and rose to become a producer for World News Tonight. After reporting for KGO-TV in San Francisco, the ABC News affiliate services News One in Washington, she co-anchored the overnight show World News Now. Ms. Chang's work has been recognized with numerous awards, including multiple Emmys, Gracies, a DuPont, a Murrow and Peabody Awards. In 2017, she was honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Front Page Awards. Born in Seoul, South Korea, and raised in Northern California, Ms. Chang graduated with honors from Stanford University with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Communications. She's married to the WNET President and CEO, Neil Saprio, and others. Together, they have 3 sons. Ms. Chang is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the founding board member of the Korean American Community Foundations. Please join me to welcome Ms. Juju Chang.
Thank you so much, Silong. That was a lovely introduction, and I am so deeply inspired and impressed by the leadership here at Augusta. I kind of want to find out if I can enroll in the fall, because you guys are awesome. I just wanted to reflect for a moment before I get started on the history-making news that happened in the hour before we logged on to this call. My son and my husband and I stopped what we were doing, and we turned on the TV, ABC News, which is our want, and we watched somewhat nervously as the judge in the Derek Chauvin trial read the verdict. And I think for the past year, our country has been in this conversation about racial equity. And in many ways, we all saw the videotape. And we all, in the court of public opinion, drew our own conclusions about what happened in that moment. And I think that now, an hour after the verdict was read, we're talking about a convicted murderer. The former officer, Derek Chauvin, And I think that many in America believe that justice was served. And I say that because not only because of the reaction that we're seeing spilling out on the streets. For the past year during the pandemic, I live in a skyrise in New York, and I could hear people shouting out the side of their windows with pots and pans at 7 o'clock every night, cheering for the healthcare heroes. That went on for months during COVID. And I hadn't heard that kind of cheering for a while until tonight, because when that verdict was read out, I suddenly heard people cheering out their windows. And I think it is a reflection of where we are. And I bring that up because this past year has been incredibly painful. And I think it's sparked a conversation about racial equity. I think in many ways, I, as a journalist, went out to the streets and covered the protests that were happening surrounding George Floyd's killing. And I saw a lot of allies. I saw a lot of Asian American activists. I saw white allies. I saw families. I saw mothers and children marching in the streets. And I think that the people who were protesting in many ways reflected the diversity of America. And to me, that was a bit of a shift, because today's verdict reminded me, of the past. Because I was a journalist in 1992 when 4 officers were acquitted of the beating of Rodney King, which led to many days of unrest in Los Angeles. And it was also a difficult chapter in the relations between Asian Americans and African Americans in Southern California. And in the 30 years since, so many bridges have been built because there's an understanding that there needs to be trust between the two communities. There needs to be a coalition, there needs to be unity. And I think that maturation, that maturity came full force with George Floyd, because in many ways, a lot of Asian American groups reached out to African American groups and said, we stand with you. And yet at the same time, we had a pandemic going on, right? And we started seeing racial disparities in the infection rates, the hospitalization rates, and the death rates of Black and brown communities. And so we were once again seeing racism reflected in front of our very eyes. And I'm sure Augusta University Medical understands that phenomena quite well. And we saw it in the Asian American community. Filipino Americans, who make a disproportionate percentage of healthcare workers, were disproportionately affected by COVID, because like Black and brown communities, there were many multi-generational families. There were less access to healthcare. There were aspects of pre-existing conditions that had to do with race. And I think what was happening at the same time was this rise that we were referring to, that Tiffany Townsend was referring to so eloquently, of hate directed at the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And I think that to understand that is to understand the history of othering, to understand the history of white supremacy against Asians, the history of marginalization. I used to say to people that you're a marginalized community if you had to fight for your rights in front of the Supreme Court. And in fact, Asian Americans were excluded from this country under the Chinese Exclusion Act. That we had to fight for our rights when Japanese Americans were interned during World War II. We had to fight for our rights in so many ways that in many ways, I think people don't understand the long history of otherness for Asian Americans. And yet at the same time, there are more modern aspects of what I would call sort of subtle anti-Asian discrimination, what we refer to as unconscious bias, that has an impact. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I'm giving a sort of truncated view of my speech, so I'm going to try to get to as much of it as I can. But first, I want to talk a little bit about myself. Silong pointed out that I was born in Korea. I was 4 when my family immigrated to this country. I started kindergarten without speaking English. Yay for immersion therapy. And I, sort of lived that immigrant struggle along with my family, though I didn't realize that we were poor and struggling. I just thought we had a big family and we were getting along just fine. But at the same time, as I would follow my father around, who ran a bunch of small businesses and worked, basically blue collar jobs, that people would look down on him. that people would treat him like a second-class citizen because of the way he looked, because of the color of his skin, because of his heavy accent. And I didn't really have words to put on that as a child, but obviously in retrospect, you see it as othering. And I feel like a lot of times it's the kind of, subconscious, unconscious bias that people have had towards me throughout my entire life. Because people will take one look at me and say, oh, where are you from? And, I often say, well, I'm from California. And they say, no, where are you from? And I sort of joke around, or, eventually I'll say I'm from Korea. But I know what they mean. They look at me and they decide the subtext of that is that I'm a foreigner. I'm not American. And it's not just me. These are friends of mine who were born here. These are friends of mine whose grandparents were born here, who are still sort of subtly othered in that way. So the question is, what does that unconscious bias mean now? And I think what we can look at and point to is the pandemic, and how in many ways the fear and the anxiety that was brought upon by the pandemic was in many ways weaponized against the Asian American community. And people at the highest levels of government were using phrases like China flu and Wuhan flu, and even more derogatorily, Kung flu, and directing it as if it was Asian Americans' fault. And what you saw subsequently in those months was a dramatic uptick in the numbers. I mean, you guys are a university, for data, right? And we saw, a 150% increase just on reported cases. Imagine how many went unreported. And the Stop AAPI Hate started registering so many of these incidents, many of whom, when they would go to police to file a report, would testify that the attackers were quoting the very words that people were hearing from the White House. And so there's a real sense that, again, that is what's classic scapegoating is, when you turn fear and blame others. And the truth is, half the people, I don't even know, more than half the people who were attacked weren't even Chinese American. There was a Thai grandfather in the Bay Area who was shoved and killed. He was Thai, wasn't even Chinese. Not that it matters, because at the end of the day, no one is a virus. No one is responsible for the flu or for COVID. It's a virus. And so the sort of scapegoating is part of the real problem. And words matter, context matters. And I think at a time when so much hate rose up in our country, we saw that between March and June of last year, there were 2,800 anti-Asian American hate crimes that were reported, incidences that went from physical attacks, verbal assaults, workplace harassment. And, you do not want to see my Twitter feed, because it was ugly and it was aggressive. And so what does this uptick have to do with the way Asians are perceived in the United States? Well, there is this thing that we refer to as the model minority fallacy, the model minority myth. And what that suggests is that, oh, well, you Asians are all wealthy and you're well off, right? And I've heard friends say, well, what's wrong with that stereotype? Because it's a good stereotype, it's a compliment. And I think, well, actually, no. Any racialized stereotype is a disservice. It dehumanizes people. And what it does actually is it renders invisible those in our community who are struggling. So, for example, in New York City, in the greater New York City area, 18% of Korean Americans, for example, live in poverty. And if that sounds high to you, it is. Asians have the highest poverty rate in New York City for 9 out of the last 12 years. But you wouldn't know it because of the model minority myth. And at the same time, they're underserved. Even though they're 15% of the population, they get less than 2% of the social services. So that invisibility that is brought on by this model minority myth is actually destructive. And Asian Americans are not a monolith, and that is part of the problem, right? And Seong will tell you, there are Asian Americans from the continent of Asia. There are Asian Americans from the subcontinent, from India, from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka. There are Asian Americans from Southeast Asia, from the Philippines, from the Pacific Islands, from Guam, and what that means is from Thailand, from Vietnam, and they represent dozens of countries, dozens of languages, dozens of cultures, right? And when they come to the United States, they bring their own lived experiences. So they're different politically. Asian Americans are not a monolith. We have very diverse communities. And as a result, Asian Americans as a community have a difficult time coalescing. But I think in many ways, this past year, the violence that we've seen directed against Asian Americans that culminated in the tragic acts in Atlanta, frankly, have galvanized the Asian American community. And I think that for so many of us, there was this recognition that the same way young activists in the Asian American communities took to the streets last year after George Floyd was killed, they turned around this year and used those same political skills, that same voice, and called for racial equity in the same way, calling for unity, calling for racial solidarity. And that's why I feel like it's a full circle moment of understanding where rather than being separated, we are united in this cause. I ended up going to Atlanta and doing that hour-long special for ABC News. A white gunman went into 3 different Asian American themed spas and killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. And when the police interviewed him, you all know, because you're in Georgia, you heard it, he told them he had a sex addiction and that he wanted to eliminate his problem. And quickly the sheriff then quoted, it said, well, this isn't about race. This is about just sex. And that sparked a lot of anger within the Asian American community because it once again dehumanizes Asian American women. And I've talked to so many who say that this has to do with the other racial stereotype, right? So you have the model minority stereotype, then you have the hypersexualized, fetishized Asian woman who is either seen as submissive and weak and vulnerable or hypersexualized in some way. And neither of those is anything short of dehumanizing. And so until you recognize that, it's hard to understand. But, it's the kind of thing that, I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable, but when I was a lot younger, I would be in a bar, for example, and, a man would come up to me and I give them grace now because maybe, I'm told that it's very hard to approach a woman in a bar. It takes a lot of courage and maybe there was some, inebriation going on, but they would look at me and they'd say, oh, you're an exotic lotus flower or what have you. And, you immediately go ugh. That's not cool. And it's not cool because you're not seeing me as a human. You're not seeing me as an individual. You're seeing me as an ethnic stereotype. And so as Tiffany said, okay, now you know better, guys, do better. And that's the only way that we break down unconscious biases is to point them out gently and say, this is why it's harmful, right? And that is why we're having these conversations. And when you look at the statistics put out by an organization called Stop AAPI Hate, if you drill down into those numbers, women reported being attacked violently at a rate 2x men. And many activists believe that that has to do with the dehumanizing of Asian American women. So in fact, there is a lot of intersectionality here, right? And when you think about unconscious bias, you think of places like Silicon Valley, where I grew up, right? Where 25% of the workers in Silicon Valley, which is like Google, Facebook, all of those tech companies, 25% of the workers there are Asian American. But when you look at upper management, the C-suites, the boardrooms, the ownership ranks, there is a really vast underrepresentation of Asian Americans in those ranks. And I think a lot of research suggests that is because you can use sort of subjective criteria, the same types of subjective criteria that is used against other people of color, often against women, where things like, oh, leadership qualities, this Asian American person doesn't have leadership qualities. And yet, what does that mean? And how do you define that? And when is that real? And when is that subjective? When is that an unconscious bias? And when is that something known as the bamboo ceiling, right? And I would tell you that business schools have done studies that when you put women and people of color in the upper ranks, you have better return on investment, you have better stock dividends, you have a better organization. But often those stereotypes block people from gaining the upper ranks. And when you think to yourself, oh, well, I don't know that that's true. I'm a very fair-minded individual, right? I just want to give you one social research survey. And it came out of University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School of Business. They did a study looking at college professors. And they emailed 259 different colleges, and they sent 6,500 emails to professors. And the emails had the same message. But the sender's name was the only variable, right? So the sender's name was either Brad Anderson, Latoya Brown, Juanita Martinez, Deepak Patel, Chang Wong. So you understand, they made up names to sort of put ethnic identities on these students. So the message was exactly the same. And guess which type of student garnered the most responses? This is like Jeopardy. Da-na-na. Right. White males. Professors ignored requests from women and minorities at a higher rate than requests from white males by a 25 percentage point difference, right? And all these researchers were studying was whether they were replying and whether they were replying to a request to meet affirmatively. So this was even more so at private universities and business schools and quote unquote lucrative fields, read non-liberal arts. And so you have to ask yourself, what is this research telling us? Well, I think it illustrates what I was suggesting about what's happening in places like Silicon Valley, because the privilege, especially in an academic setting, despite all the controversy about affirmative action and Title IX, looking towards gender and racial equity, there are still a lot of areas of unconscious bias. And I think part of that is just pointing it out, right? Gently, because think about the implications of that. If you were to then take that and put it into a corporate setting, I've heard so many successful people and leaders say, well, the secret to my success was I had a mentor who helped me out, right? Well, what happens when you email a bunch of professors and only certain ones get a positive response, right? That is, if you reverse engineer that, you know where that ends up, right? So how do you deal with this knowledge of unconscious bias going forward? You don't like run into your professor's office and accuse them of unconscious bias, right? You need to distinguish yourself as an individual, sort of like the guy in the bar who sees me as some racialized stereotype. You need to make sure that you step out and are seen and offer up ideas and opportunities for your professors, for your authority figures, for your bosses in the future, to see you and your merits as an individual. And again, gently pointing out these unconscious biases have everything to do with how we move forward. And, I think that, I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to give us a sense of like, what it is that we're dealing with as an Asian American community. We're dealing with historic otherness, right? We're dealing with lingering stereotypes that continue to dehumanize. And we're dealing with lingering unconscious bias that in this open air environment, and we've seen it time and time again, when you block the gender on an orchestra tryout, more women get the job. When you block the gender on science festival nominations, or when you do self-nominations instead of having high-ranking professionals nominate, then more women and people of color win out. There are ways in which we can block and scaffold against unconscious biases that are out there every day. Now, as for Stop AAPI Hate, I think the key is to reach across the aisles and break down barriers and unite as much as we can. I've talked to community activists across the country, and I'm like, what should people do to help the Asian community? And I've heard people in Chinatown say, come eat in Chinatown. We're like having more harm from people scared to come and eat in our restaurants and shop in our markets. What else can you do? Well, one young Asian American activist took it upon herself. She was like in her 20s. She took it upon herself to translate into multiple languages instructions on how to report a hate crime. There are so many constructive ways in which you can get involved. The Asian American Journalists Association just sent me an email today. They started a fundraiser called that everyone is having such sort of like sympathy trauma and empathy trauma that they are launching a fundraiser called Dumplings for Therapy. And it's about providing social services by raising money by selling soup dumplings, which are among my favorite things. So that's just a taste of kind of what are the many things that I've seen and felt and thought about. And I'm super excited to hear your panel talk about their lived experiences. And I'll be here and join in on the Q&A shortly after.
Thank you so much, Ms. Chang, for the wonderful and informative speech. I know for sure that I speak on behalf of everyone else that your words have inspired and motivated me. And Ms. Chang, I feel like I have a sister in you. I share the same sentiment when I heard your story, coming here when you were 4 years old as an immigrant with your parents, with being made fun of with heavy accents. I totally understand that. And yeah. And as we can see, we have a lot of work to do in order to see the justice and the peace in our society that we want. But I think having events like this and having you, Ms. Chang, right here really help us towards that goal. And I'm glad and I'm very honored to introduce the next segment following Ms. Chang's inspirational speech is the In Our Own Words panel. And this panel consists of voices from Augusta University, members of the City of Augusta as well. So for our first panelist, please welcome Anna Ramanathan. He is the Director of Administration at MCG, Medical College of Georgia. He was born and raised in Singapore with an Indian Hindu heritage. And he has seen the benefits and impact of a cohesive environment. At the same time, he also personally has been disadvantaged by inconsiderate comments and actions from others. This blended experience has made him such a staunch believer to be cognizant of anti-racial thoughts. And today, since migrating to the U.S. in 1997, he sees opportunities for structural and long-lasting improvements amidst all the races across the country.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So being an Asian American, the March 16, 2021 Atlanta Spa shooting event shook me hard. Having read of similar news in other states, I had a feel that this would not happen close to where we live, let alone it being within 2.5 hours from where we are. Each of the lost lives background echoes mine and other Asian Americans' strive for success in this beautiful country filled with opportunities and grace. Many Asian Americans came to America with little to none, as Juju referenced earlier, and established ourselves with hard work. Pursuit for higher education, like me, was another motivation for many of us. While being respectful to our roots, we slowly integrated into our American ecosystem and culture. Our local Arts in the Hearts event in Augusta, Georgia is a classic example. The Hindu Temple of Augusta is a key contributor, and my family is closely related to that exercise. And it reminds me that my 15-year-old, my wife, myself, we will camp there for 2.5 days, and we would run the Mehndi tent for the temple. To me, this event that happened on March 16th is a continued reflection of a societal fragmentation, where value of this great country and human lives continues to become more questionable. We need to continue increasing our awareness that leads to an increased cohesive society. We need to have more events similar to Arts in the Hearts that celebrates the societal richness. Unfortunately, the law enforcement authorities who have failed in many instances need to proactively identify such March 16th events proactively and ensure they never happen. A personal reflection on me. When I grew up in Singapore to parents of South Indian origin, I was exposed to multicultural experience from day zero. Singapore's culture is primarily represented by Chinese, Malays, Indians, and Eurasians. Similar to US, the cultural richness was unfortunately defined by the racial majority. In my recollection, Chinese, 75% of the population, silently or openly presented their views to the community, which became, a rule of the law in many instances. With this in mind, let me narrate a short story when I was 15 years old. I was in a class with all Chinese students, and I picked up some Mandarin along the way, which still I remember. During the mid part of the year, a young man with Chinese ethnicity joined the class. He finally became a very good friend of mine, but during the first few days, he did not know who I was by name. On a particular warm afternoon, we had a physical exercise activity. We were tasked to run in a single file, and he was running behind me. On that day, I could have possibly slowed the file. To gain my attention, as he did not know my name, he yelled from the back and said, "Blackie, can you run faster?" He did not know my name, and he looked at my color and he thought it was black, and he called me as a Blackie. Kind of puzzling. And I did not, think it was me. It did not dawn on me that he was referring to me naturally. He pursued his comment further. At that time, subconsciously, I turned back. Our eyes connected, and I felt something was missing. I stood out and I requested him to step up. At that time, he realized that I was not comfortable with his comment. He recognized he missed the boat. To me, that was an example of how a racial majority pushed a perspective that was incorrect. At that point in time, I would have wished my other Chinese friends to stand up and say that was incorrect and did the right course of action. When I reflect back on what happened about nearly 30 years, I'm giving my age, I think we have a similar opportunity in the States, in Augusta, where if such an event happens, we all collectively can represent and stand up for the minority in such a microaggressive stage. With that, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Anna, for the presentation. Coming up next, our second guest panelist is Dr. Ray Rufo. He's the current board member and historian of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, also known as CCBA, and he's also personally a good friend of mine. He has been on an active role with the association since 1981 and served as the association's president in 1984, 1990, and 2011. Dr. Rufo retired after 27 years serving in his private dentistry. And while he was working as a dentist, he also taught at the School of Dentistry in MCG from 1971 to 1984. Please join us to welcome Dr. Rufo. Dr. Rufo, I think you're muted. The mute button should be like in the center
There
of
we
the...
go. Can you hear me now?
Hey, yes, sir.
Okay.
Good to
I
have you.
appreciate this opportunity to share with you. This session is necessary because of COVID-19. And you are probably familiar with the term Wuhan virus, and you're also familiar with the term China virus, Chinese virus, Kung Fu virus. This was used by our divisive divider-in-chief, and it was used so many times, although it was advised and brought up that it's a very derogatory term. Now, how do we cope with this? Well, we're going to have to be cognizant of the fact that it is hurting and harmful. We have to make our public aware that we are hurt by this. We need to speak out. We can't be the usual submissive Asian. We need to say that this is not right. think about the Asians and the Indians and all other minorities that are in the healthcare industry, which we are great contributors to society. We're part of society. But at the turn of a thing like this virus, it gives you an idea how fickle society is, especially American society. At the turn of a drop of a hat, you can be a victim. People turn against you. I know that at my gatherings, I bring it up. Most Asians would not. I bring it up and let people know that it's hurtful. I want them to be aware of it. And I've heard the term that racial bias, discrimination is just like a body odor. You try to cover it up, but it takes a super effort to hide it, to get rid of it. And when parents experience or have this, it affects the children, and unconsciously it grows, and it happens. I remember incidents that I've experienced in college. Very harmful, hurtful incidents. One, for instance, in dental school, we had a certain professor. We were doing a procedure, and I mentioned the fact that, could this be done this way? And the comment I received, maybe in China it could be done this way, but you're not in China. Now that is as offensive as you can get. Another incident, I was thumbing for a ride home. I was at the University of Georgia. I was with my good friends and roommates, Caucasians, who I went through high school and part of college. We're thumbing a ride, and we would get rides from one city to another. And we were in a small town in Georgia, which Lincolnton. And there were four of us. I was the only Asian in the group. This car stopped by, picked us up. I happened to be sitting on my suitcase in the background. As soon as I stood up and showed up, the guy recognized me as an Asian. You know what happened? He drove off. You can imagine what I felt. You can imagine what my friends felt. But these incidents cannot be harbored or retained. They're harmful. They're an anchor because they are offset by so many good occasions, so many good memories I've had. I had been in practice 27 years. It was such a pleasant experience. I really enjoyed all my patients. I experienced no discrimination. In fact, I was admired and complimented because of my Asian culture. Worth ethics. That's the word for Chinese workers. And in fact, I really felt good about it because quite a few of my physician friends had their families as my patients. My fellow dental friends, they even became my patients. Several of my high school professors became my patients. I couldn't have asked for a better situation. So, all that said is to offset the meanness and the negative experiences I've had. It certainly outweighs it. And society today truly, in Augusta now, the Asian people enjoy a very good reputation. We have Chinese in all professions and in dentistry. Oh, by the way, I was fortunate enough to be the first Chinese dentist to graduate Emory University School of Dentistry. Was also the first Chinese dentist in Georgia. That was really a scary step because, just give you an example, I was working for Chinese, TSQ, the department store in Savannah. Mr. Chu and I were very close. I was working in the drug department, and we became very close. Mr. Chu asked me one morning, he said, Ray, where do you plan to practice? And I said, Augusta. And he said, oh, are there that many Chinese in Augusta? So you see the mentality there. And you know what? When I started practice, I could say maybe 1% of my patients were Chinese. Now, not that I hold that against my Chinese friends, because they probably knew I was a brat and could never amount to anything. Maybe that's the reason I had no Chinese patients. But they complimented me by saying, well, he's too expensive. But you know, life in Augusta and the Chinese in Augusta, we really enjoy a good relationship. It's we are involved in all civic activities, and that's the name of it. That's the name of the game. Well, in order to cope with this situation, I feel that we, not only Chinese now, we the minorities, we have to get involved with the public civic activities. Give of your time, your efforts, and your talents. Keep in mind now, being a minority, you are going to have to be at least 10% better than the average person in order to take advantage of the level playing field. Think about that. Now you said, well, you could say to yourself, well, why do I have to excel to be average then? Think about it this way. That has made you a better person because your standards are higher already. Do you realize how many of the minorities are in leadership role now compared to 10 years from now? You see, it's working. We minorities are realizing that extra effort pays off. It has to pay off. If it doesn't pay off in your salary, it's making you a stronger person because you have to be stronger to survive. You're better than average. So you excel. So your goal should be assume responsibilities. Make yourself indispensable in whatever you do. If you're working for a company, be so important, take on responsibilities, have it so that the company will not survive without you. You make yourself indispensable. You've got to be the key person. In any event that I enter in, I try to offer my opinions. I'm not the closed mouth type. I'm the loose mouth kind, as my wife would say. In fact, that has gotten me in trouble, but mostly it has done, I think, paid off very well. It's given me leadership roles. I had the privilege of being the president of the Augusta Museum of History because of my mouth, and I feel like I made improvements there. I started a children's indigent dental clinic. I felt like I had to give back to society, and that's helped me a lot. But anyway, that's the attitude we should have. To give of yourself. Don't be selfish. Assume leadership roles. It's going to be harder, meaning that you're going to have more responsibilities. That's the name of the game. You're important because of your responsibility. Now, how do we cope with a lot of these comments that we get? We Asians, people will say, how long have you been in this country? Now, you could be offended. You could be smart you can be a smart aleck like I tend to be. I will say, well, I've only been here 3 years. And they'll say, well, you sure speak good English. Well, I went to a very good foreign language school, and you should try it. And then eventually they find out that that guy, he's a retired dentist. And then they come back and said, well, why did you tell me that? And I said, well, I commuted. I'm from China, but I commuted and it wasn't that rough. And you're playing into their hands. If you react to a comment, they have won. So if you slough it off, they suffer because they have had no effect on you. So let me close by saying, take on responsibility, make yourself known, make people know that you are there, you're not an object. Be a leader, assume the responsibility, don't be fearful of it. Thank you for the opportunity. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rufo. That was inspirational. And I learned something new about you too today. I've known you for so many years, and I didn't know you were the first Asian dentist in Georgia. Wow, that opened my eyes. So our next speaker, for my panelist, is Christina Cho. She is a 1.5 generation Korean American who grew up in Jones Creek, Georgia. As a third-year medical student in MCG, she worked with student leaders to organize courageous conversations in MCG to intentionally process, reflect, discuss, and address racial justice as it relates to current events and health equity. She also currently serves as the co-president of the National Board of Korean American Medical Student Association. Hey, Christina.
Hi, Shilong. Thank you so much. I just want to say, I think Juju basically covered everything I was going to say. And so I think a lot of what I'm going to share is kind of, I guess, echoing some of the themes that she talked about. But I thought what would be kind of helpful is just by sharing some of like my disclaimers in terms of some of the things I was hesitant about before sharing at this panel. And so, I was invited to share a little bit about, my personal response to Atlanta shooting and just how anti-Asian violence has affected our community. And I think for me, one thing that kind of I had mixed feelings about was, how to talk about this, more broader, somewhat abstract concept and issue in the context of a tragedy that happened just 1 month ago. I think it's important for us to acknowledge the fact that this is, something that happened very close to home. And one of the victims, their two sons currently live in Duluth, Georgia, and that's an area with a lot of Asian American community members, and that's somewhere I grew up around. And so I had some mixed feelings about that, and I kind of wonder if maybe some of my Black colleagues and friends can relate. Just I had mixed feelings about sharing about our community's trauma. In the sense of, I sometimes feel pressure that, sharing about this has to be a way of trying to get people to care. It feels like you're trying to convince people by sharing your experience that this is a cause worthy to explore. And so those were just some of the things that I was wrestling with before this panel. And I thought it was important to share because as I was reflecting on it, I just realized, if our community is really going to heal and move forward, we need to have some of these more, I think, raw and honest conversations as it relates to this. So again, a lot of what I'm sharing is kind of things that Juju talked on, but I just wanted to share just, my response specifically to the Atlanta shooting and how I processed it, and just share a little bit why I think this event had such a strong response from our community. And so the first thing I wanted to talk about was just, I think for a lot of people, when they looked at this event, it was easy to look at it as an isolated, mass shooting. And that's something we've seen a lot in our nation. But I think for me as an Asian American, when I was processing this event, I was looking at it in the context of everything that happened this past year during the pandemic. And of course, I'm sure, people touched on this, but, over the past year, we really saw a rise in overt anti-Asian rhetoric by some of our political leaders. We saw, businesses being targeted. My father is a pastor, so we moved to the United States for him to pursue vocational ministry, seminary education. And during this time, we saw churches vandalized, and so when I would see things like that in the news, although that didn't happen to my dad's church, there was a sense of very real fear for me. We also saw, even till now, we saw incidents of assaults happening to our elderly community members. And I think, that was particularly difficult to watch and process because as a 1.5 generation Asian American, we very much live with the reminder of the sacrifices of our parents or maybe our grandparents. And so seeing them being the targets of these kind of acts of violence was, really challenging. And I think the second part of just why, for me, the Atlanta shooting hit pretty hard was the fact that, as the stories of the victims were coming out, there were so many parts of their story that, as an Asian American, I could relate to. So, for example, one of the victims, she was a single mother, came from Korea. She, was working in a more challenging work condition to provide for her two sons, who she has now left behind. And there was fortunately a GoFundMe that has really supported them. But I think these are, parts of the Asian American experience and story that you don't really often hear in the news. Juju kind of talked about there's this model minority myth of Asian Americans being very successful. And, in some ways, I guess it's a positive stereotype. I feel like it kind of erases, all of the challenges, especially that the older generation has gone through. So I can relate to the fact that, I've had experiences just seeing the way, people would talk down or look down on my parents because of their broken English, when in fact they can speak multiple languages, which is, I think, something to be very proud of. And I think, in Korean, we have this word called chong, and it's this affection that we have for other members of our community. So it's kind of like if I went to a Korean restaurant and a grandmother came and saw me, she might kind of see me as her grandchild and give me a little extra serving of panchan, which is like a side dish, It's this word that we have that connects our community together, and we're very collectivist as a culture. And so I think for a lot of us, when we're looking at the stories of the victims, we're just recognizing the fact that there were these 6 Asian women that had been murdered, we saw our auntie, so to speak. We saw our mom. We saw someone that we know from our church or wherever, And so I think that was another layer of, just the response that I had. And then lastly, as an Asian American woman, I think it hit another layer in the sense that while people were debating about whether or not, the shooting was racially motivated, or if it really was just, something due to this perpetrator, like sexual addiction, I think for me as an Asian American woman, for me, it was just a question of how can you really separate those two things? And Juju touched on that. How do you separate racism from the way that Asian American women are often hypersexualized? I've had a similar incident where I had a man follow me to my car, and then, knock on my window and tell me how exotic I was. Very similar to Juju. I was nodding my head through lots of parts of her story because there's just so many similar elements. And so I think, what I'm trying to convey is, when we saw that Atlanta shooting, part of, I think, why the Asian American response was so strong was because a lot of us could relate to so many parts of it. And I think it was just kind of the thing that broke the camel's back, in the sense there was a lot of pent up frustration, and perhaps, arguably like resentment, just in the sense that a lot of, issues that had been happening just hadn't been visible. It had been happening, but no one had really cared to notice. And I see Juju nodding her head, like major news outlets were not covering some of these stories until now. And so even for me, like speaking at this panel, I had mixed feelings, in the sense this is the first time I've ever been asked to share about my Asian American experience. And it's been in the context of such a horrific tragedy, and why does it have to be that way? And I'm not trying to be a downer, because I really think, this is an important part of the conversation that we're having. But the thing that I kind of wanted to convey, especially because our faculty here and people in positions of leadership, is, I just really want to call you to be inclusive in the way that you're inviting voices to the table. And I know that's kind of like cliche, but when we're having these conversations about race, is it just a black and white conversation? I think it's important we have a lot of these black and white conversations, because the legacy of slavery is so, huge and horrific, and it's something we have to tackle. But I think we can all benefit from having a more nuanced conversation. And something that I wanted to say for the folks that are listening is, I've been a part of a lot of conversations like this, And you walk away and you feel really good because you're like, yeah, unity, yeah, diversity, equity. And you have all these like really great feelings that's coming together. But I just want to encourage the people who are listening to not just stop there and feel good about this moment, but really meaningfully respond in your inner circles, you know? And so when you see casual racism, you know, do something about it, because I think, you know, the way we normalize anti-Asian racism affects the way we talk about it, and the way we talk about it affects the way we act on it. And yeah, I just want to encourage people, you know, apart from these bigger conversations, to build relationships across, you know, different cultures and ethnicities, because I really think that's how we can move forward. You know, that's the only way we can get deeper and kind of get to the root of the problem. And so I could go on a long time on this topic, clearly, but that's just part of what I wanted to share. And as a medical student, you know, I'm hoping that we can have more of these conversations in the context of medicine, but for those of you who are in education or in public relations or whatever field you are in, I hope that you will continue to, yeah, bring these topics to the forefront. So thank you so much, Shilong, and for the folks who organized this event and allowing me to share.
Thank you, Christina. I appreciate you so much. And I also feel, you know, share the same sentiment. Model citizen, Asian, and I get asked all the time, are you good at math? No, I'm not, period. No more discussion. I don't even want to engage in that. So I'm happy to introduce our last panelist today is Dr. Sudha Ratan. She's the professor of political science in the Department of Social Sciences at Augusta University. She teaches courses in the undergraduate and graduate security studies programs, and she has served here since 2013 as the consultant of the Afghanistan-Pakistan region of the Rule of Law Consortium at the University of South Carolina. So please join us to welcome Dr. Ratan.
Thank you, Shilong. I think we're going to be tight on time, so I'll make this really quick. I just want to say that thank you for inviting me to this panel on a day where we have much to celebrate, even though we are kind of dealing with very difficult issues. The verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial is really a victory for the rule of law. And I think communities of color across this country and around the world, in fact, will be looking at this verdict because it reassures people that in fact, if you push and take some of these protests to the streets and make a case that perhaps the rule of law will work. And I think for so many people of color in this country, there was so much skepticism about the verdict in this trial. And what Ms. Chang said about hearing people celebrating on the streets is really a reflection, a very dark reflection on what people of color feel about the prospects for justice in the courts in this country. So I, for one, am really grateful for that verdict. And then the other thing to kind of celebrate today, I think, is the success of activism. And I want to spend my few minutes just talking about that because Ms. Chang talked about, the challenge for the Asian American community in this country is that the immigration into this country from Asia is very diverse. We have groups of people coming in from very different cultures and different countries, and uniting them has been always a problem. And I think the shooting in Atlanta, as dark as that was, and as much as it's caused so much pain in this community, for the first time, we are seeing bridges being built across these communities, across these Asian communities. And in Georgia, we've seen very effective work being done by Pan-Asian groups. And they've been building bridges with the African-American community. And I think there's a real recognition in the course of the last year or so that the Asian American and Pacific Islander community needs to learn from the African American community and how to push for its case, in dealing with issues of discrimination. The other point I want to make with respect to Georgia is that we've actually been very successful in sending people up to the legislature. So we have gone from one member in the Georgia House to now we have 5, 2 in the Senate and 3 in the House. And that's really a reflection of the growing power of Asian American voters in this state. And hopefully we will be doing more of that kind of grassroots work to improve activism in the state of Georgia, because I think if anything has come out of this terrible pandemic year for the Asian American community, it is the importance of activism and the importance of having our voices heard. For too long in this country, Asian American communities have been invisible, and a lot of that has been by choice, because partly because of the model minority myth and the idea that if you stay under the radar, perhaps it won't get so bad. I think a lot of those myths have been shattered in the last year or so. And so I, for one, as a political scientist, am very excited about the opportunities that I see, especially in Georgia, to kind of build the bridges that need to be built if we are to make changes in the system. So I will stop here so that we have some time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ratan, and thank you to all the panelists for your time and presence here with us today. I'd like to turn the microphone virtually back to Dr. Townsend, Chief Diversity Officer of Augusta University, for the next part of the program.
Thank you, Silong. Thank you for your expert moderation. I wish we were in person and I could have everyone give you a hand. You did such a wonderful job. I thank you for that. I also want to thank our special guest, Ms. Juju Chang, for her really inspirational and poignant words. And I think, we have some marching orders, right? We have a direction that we can go. And I want to also thank all of our panelists for sharing your truth. It's often hard to do that. And the fact that you decided to do that with us means a lot, and it really shows that we're trying to build a community. Open communication is so powerful, and it really can contribute to healing. So in that vein, we're going to open the floor for questions. I want to emphasize that this discussion is about validating the experiences of our community members and coming together with an eye toward healing solutions. So I'm going to ask that you align with those goals when you're posing your comments and your questions. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jessica Dillard-Wright, who has a question from our audience.
Yes, I'd also like to thank everyone for your truths and for being here tonight. And Silong, way to go. Fantastic job moderating. The question that we have is from Candace Griffith, and it reads, what do you believe people can do specifically to reduce hate and stereotypes?
And anyone can answer that question. I will kind of go down. I guess you could raise your hand, but if anyone wants to jump in and answer that question. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but.
Well, it's Juju. I would say if you look at the social science, so much of it has to do with education and teaching things like empathy and the core values that Augusta enumerated. There's also research that says that if you invite somebody to lunch, and get to know somebody who looks different than you, that can help foster understanding and coalition building. And I do think that now is the time to do that. And I think that just to dovetail off of what Professor Ratan was saying is that, Georgia was a classic example of the kind of voting rights efforts that this coalition is talking about, racial unity and solidarity, because the Asian American vote made a difference in the Georgia Senate race. And the ALDEF, which is the Asian equivalent of the NAACP, has been working for decades towards ballot access and, bilingual, ballots. And this is a coalition that I was speaking with Derek Johnson of the NAACP and Senator Padilla of California, who took Kamala Harris's seat when she became vice president, and members of the ADL. This is an arena, for example, where sort of unity can work towards, a coalition building.
Anyone else want to join in and share some thoughts on that question?
I certainly did. Go ahead, Dr. Chang.
Oh, I was just going to say that, and I think this came up in the panel that, one way to cut this off at the knees is when you see something happening in front of you that even slightly smacks of stereotyping, unconscious bias, it is to simply stop and acknowledge that. And it doesn't have to be ugly. I mean, we're in the South, It's one of the things I taught my daughter when she went off to college in California. Be nice. The South is very good at being nice. And you can say some pretty snarky things, but in a very nice way.
That's Southern hospitality, right? There are ways in which you could use that, certainly to interrupt bias when you're seeing it. And I often talk about using humor, right? And just holding up a mirror, because sometimes people are just unaware. And so when you hold up the mirror and say, this is what I'm seeing, a lot of folks will say, oh, I didn't know, right? And so sometimes it's as simple as that. Sometimes it requires more, but certainly that's a start. But thank you for that. Anyone else?
Yes, I was going to speak to that as well. I do believe that it's important for us to spend time with people who are different from us. And our tendencies are to congregate with folk who are just like us. And typically when we congregate with folk that are just like us, we limit ourselves to the same old thought patterns, the same old behaviors. But when we spend time with people and walk together and talk together, I believe in those situations we can solve just about anything. The second thing is little steps do matter. We're not going to solve problems overnight. It takes time, and to be patient and consistent in developing our relationships is going to also be helpful in that process.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have another question, and I think this is actually kind of a good jumping off point for that question. And this question is from Rusha Samudra, and it is, how much of this should be the burden of the individual and how much can be done at the systemic level?
Can I respond to that? I think this has come up several times in the panel that so much of what we saw this past year was absolutely triggered by leadership in the White House. And so I think while the conditions are there socially, we saw how quickly it can become inflammatory because of what was being said by President Trump, by former President Trump. And so I think, I don't think it's an either or thing. I think leadership roles and people sitting in leadership roles have a huge burden on their shoulders to behave responsibly and to be aware of the impact of their statements. I don't think it's right to put the onus on the individual who's at the receiving end of this, because this is part of the reason why there's been such a long history of invisibility on the part of the Asian American community, I think.
I want to add to that, Dr. Samudra's question. So how much of it is the individual's responsibility? How much is the systematic? So for me growing up, I always just tell myself, I have control of myself. I can control my anger. I can control how I react. What others say to me, intentionally, unintentionally, how I react is what I'm responsible for. And I always live under the impression that I should not expect a system to support me or to back me up, but that has changed. Since we have had this conversation, I'm sure many of us believe that this should be a group effort. This should be a coherent effort. But I always tell myself to control my emotions. If somebody asks me something offensive, I would answer one or two letters and then, cut myself off and stop. I think that kind of gives them an impression that I'm not feeling welcome to have the conversation. And I sometimes will walk away. Or I have another person, a friend of mine, or another individual start talking about different topics. So I do not try to educate them. I, at least back in the day, the courage that, that we were lacking was that I didn't think that it was worth my time to educate some of the folks. There are people who unintentionally make, ask questions that are kind of insensitive, but I've always just kind of, tell from our relationship, tell from our tone of voice and our interaction to see if that's intentional or not. And most of the time, I'm thankful there are people that, recognize that they make a mistake and they will try to learn. And that really helps me a lot. It makes me feel better. And it helps me learn, too, to how to cope with these kind of situations.
And yet, so many of the answers lie in systemic change. Because let's face it, we've begun to see the systemic and structural inequalities. And one of the areas that all of this AAPI hate has brought up is the difficulty in policing Asian American neighborhoods. So in New York, for example, and in the Bay Area and in these concentrated urban areas, police officers aren't bilingual. And so in order to investigate a hate crime, you have to take witness statements and get them to say, oh, yes, I heard this man who attacked me say what exactly? What is the Asian slur that rises to a hate crime? And if the victim doesn't speak the language, how does the victim then report what a non-Asian perpetrator has said to them? So that this is an area where systemically it's difficult, and also there's sort of historic mistrust. There's also Asian Americans suffer from the same sorts of mistrust of police that the Hispanic community does, because oftentimes Asian Americans are undocumented. Asian Americans struggle with issues that intersect with poverty and lack of opportunity. And, these are folks who, in urban settings like New York City are delivering, Chinese food to your door, or working in nail salons off the books, or working as child caregivers or healthcare workers, for less than minimum wage. And so these are issues that are systemic and have a huge impact on the Asian American community. And there are many areas in which, again, working at structural solutions are important.
And I also believe that the power is with you, and I think it's an intersection. We have the opportunity to come up, formulate a group and become the change, and and energize others towards what we want to accomplish. I recognize it's a little harder to do it immediately, but I think if we can sow the seeds and make it generational, we have an opportunity to go towards the systemic change.
And can I just say that I want to do a shout out to Stacey Abrams, who's done such an amazing job of building those bridges in Georgia. I throw her name in every chance I get. So.
And I feel like that's a great note to kind of wrap this conversation up. We do have a few other questions here, but I think that these questions are introducing additional complexity and are actually a really great starting place for a future conversation. So we will circle back to these questions at a later date. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Townsend.
So thank you. We've come to the end of our discussion today, and I want to, can you guys see my screen? Can everybody see my screen? Can you just nod to let me know you can see? Okay, great. So I want to thank you all for joining us on a Tuesday evening. You came and decided to come and share and participate in this conversation, and that means a lot, certainly, as we're trying to build community. Again, I want to thank everyone who made this panel possible, and so quickly. I mean, we pulled this together, and it could not have happened if if everyone didn't just give generously of their time and support our office. It's your support is amazing. Special thanks to our guest, Ms. Juju Chang, President Keel, Provost McKinnon, and AU Health CEO, Ms. Katrina Kiefer. A very warm thank you to Chaplain Francois, Silong Chen, and each of our panelists who shared a little piece of themselves. I want to also extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone behind the scenes that made this possible. The College of Nursing for their sponsorship support, our super IT team, our chat monitors, Deborah Arnold, Logan DeSantos, and Dr. Jessica Dillard Wright, our planning committees, particularly Dr. Vanessa Spearman, who jumped in and finalized many of the plans for the panel. As I mentioned before, I hope this is the beginning of continued dialogue, and together we will unite in our efforts to advocate for justice. Thank you guys for joining us tonight, and I look forward to another conversation. Take care.